Hello and welcome back to On the Spot. I'm Christopher Taylor of My Astro Chris, and you're back on the spot with me. So today we have actually a special kind of reading. It's what's called a relocation reading. So I have a client that has asked me to investigate one place that she's looking to relocate to. And what I'm going to do is first of all talk a little bit about her natal chart. Then we'll look at a chart of the location where she wants to move relative to her natal chart. This is a process called astrocartography, if you want to get technical, but relocation is perfectly acceptable in this case, and that's what we'll call it. Anyway, so with this client of mine, you can see her natal chart here, and unlike most readings, I'm not going to talk about the sun sign. In this case, her sun sign is in Virgo, or her rising sign or moon or anything. I really want to zero in on the pieces of her chart, the components that represent herself on a soul level, and how those components may have an easier or harder time expressing themselves in a different location, different from the birth location, okay? And so what I did was I figured, I pulled out one piece. In this case, there isn't a major difference. If we're talking about thousands of miles away, there can be a pretty big difference. In this case, with the natal chart, she was born in Denver, Colorado, okay? And the move she's looking to do, and right now she's in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is very, very similar to Denver, Colorado astrologically. Not too much shifts go on between those two charts. But what she's looking to do is move to West Austin, Texas, around that area. So the difference between Denver and West Austin is not that large, but in this case it was large enough to at least produce some piece that I can talk about here in how it actually is going to provide her an outlet for a piece of herself to express, okay? And so if we look at the natal chart, right here, now what I want you to do is focus in, see the two circles right there circling the Mars up on the top of the chart and Jupiter on the bottom of the chart. Also look at the arrow pointing to Pluto. In her natal chart, you're looking at there, Pluto is very close to the IC, the bottom of the chart, okay? And so it's opposing the midheaven. It's near the bottom of the chart, near the cusp of the fourth house. And in that chart, Jupiter is well into the fourth house, and Mars is well into the 10th house. Now, what happens when we look at the chart for West Austin, Texas? If you look at this, now look at the same zones. What happened here was that Mars and Jupiter, that opposition between Mars and Jupiter, actually shifts so that Mars is closer to the 10th house cusp, the midheaven, and that Jupiter is much closer to the 4th house cusp, the IC. And Pluto, you notice, is backed off of the IC. So these three little subtle shifts, in my opinion, are actually a pretty big deal in this case. So what does this all mean? Anyway, so the component of herself, represented by the Mars opposition to Jupiter in her chart. She has Mars in Pisces opposite Jupiter in Virgo. Okay, this is a very freedom-needing and freedom-loving side of herself, all right? And what this tells us, especially with Pluto on the 4th house cusp, is that in her natal situation, so her kind of life story in a lot of ways, that when it came to freedom in the home, especially with Virgo on the cusp of the 4th house, that things were slightly restricted in her perception. She perceived that there weren't many options. Let's put it that way. It's a perception that options are limited, and there's a certain way things have to be done, and there's a certain inner frustration, that inner freedom in herself that wants to release, wants to just be who she is, okay? And so this is something she takes with her whole life, is this inner sense of rambunctiousness almost, this almost inner, not quite rebel, but this inner part of herself that just really wants to put all of her energy into things, but feeling like she's always held back, always kind of restricted, okay? And so when we look at the West Austin, Texas chart, when we have Mars and Jupiter, that opposition, that part of her that represents her more energetic and optimistic and kind of zealot and gung-ho kind of energy, this has a better chance to express itself in West Austin, Texas than it does in her native Denver, Colorado, or in Cheyenne, Wyoming, okay? And that is because the 10th and 4th house cusps, along with the 1st and 7th house cusps, those four houses represent energy outlets, okay? And so with Mars and Jupiter getting a chance to align with these energy outlets a little bit easier, that allows for this part of herself to unleash itself more easily in this location, all right? And that's something that she probably instinctively feels, which is part of the reason why she's drawn there. There's a feeling, again, from this chart that her childhood growing up, there was some restrictions, some things that just weren't allowed. And as part of her path with Pisces on the 10th house cusp, where she wants to expand and grow and transform in some ways and not be so restricted. And this place, this location, is one place where that freedom-loving part of herself has an opportunity for that. All right? And so that's just one piece of looking at a move from Cheyenne, Wyoming, in this case, to West Austin, Texas, but we're looking at the natal chart, which is in Denver, Colorado. And so going from that natal position to West Austin, Texas. And that's one piece of what that move might give her in terms of opportunities for expression, okay? And with Pluto in that chart as well, backing off of the fourth house, it gives her a sense of freedom in her home space and less restriction. So there is a sense of almost being able to create the idea of home the way she wants to in a place like West Austin, Texas, for her. And also, when it comes to her place in the world, it's almost like there's opportunities with Mars up in the 10th house, closer to the cusp of the 10th house, opportunities to kind of put her energy into things where she might have felt held back from putting energy into things in other places. In West Austin, Texas, she might want to start a group, for example, and lead that group. You know, something like that is just an example of that. But there's some sense of her energies tuned up and wanting to input them and infuse them somewhere, okay? And so I also wanted to look at her natal chart in terms of transits going on, because she'd mentioned that she's looking to move in the spring. All right, here we are. It's February 2nd, 2011. And so I'm looking at her chart now. Here's her natal chart again. And what I want to focus in on is the planet Mercury down in the bottom. All right, that's the planet that's circled down there. And there's a couple of planets that are transiting that are hitting Mercury, which are Saturn below the chart there, and that's forming a conjunction with Mercury. And then we have Jupiter up on the top of the chart transiting, and that is going to form an opposition to Mercury as well. And why am I picking on Mercury in this case? Well, Mercury is the ruler of the sign Virgo. And Virgo is what we see on the bottom of the chart, the fourth house, representing home. Okay, so if there's going to be shifts in where we live, in our foundation of what we're resting on, and things like that, usually the planet that rules the sign on the fourth house is going to be hit by something. And in this case, Mercury is. Okay, going back to about Halloween or so, this is when Saturn initiated its contact with Mercury, and that's going to last back and forth through the spring and then into the middle of the summer, really about mid-August or so, we can say. And so really Saturn conjunct Mercury represents, it's a time period in her life in general where she's getting serious about where she lives. All right, that's really what it means. Saturn conjunct the ruler of the fourth house is getting serious about where I live, getting serious about what supports me. Okay, so that's kind of holding the space here from the fall of 2010, around Halloween or so, all the way through about August of 2011. And then we have Jupiter up top, which is going to be racing through Aries throughout this spring, and which means it will be opposing anything in Libra. And this Mercury happens to be down in Libra in her chart at about 12 degrees Libra. So when does Jupiter hit 12 degrees Libra and then therefore form the opposition? Well, that's going to happen around mid to late March of 2011. So just less than a couple of months from now, we're going to have Jupiter almost like a trigger. Saturn's holding the space, saying it's time to get serious about where I live, and then Jupiter comes by and triggers that point. So I would say that mid to late March, as far as taking action goes toward moving, this would be the time when potentially those initial actions are taken to actually make a move. And it could be that that the decision is not to move, but the idea is that that time period would be when things are active, mid to late March. This is when things are going to kind of leap forward in the discussions and in the preparation for the idea of actually moving, okay? And and so that'll finish that up. And what's also going on here, if we highlight again, the Jupiter and Mars that we see, that we already talked about, that component of herself that is the freedom lover, that really needs expression, really needs some kind of way to express. Well, the Jupiter and Saturn, while also, aspecting Mercury, they're also aspecting this Jupiter and Mars, but in a much more discordant kind of way. They'll be forming aspects known as quincunxes and semisextiles, and these kinds of interactions are more along the lines of creative adjustment. All right. So this greater period, again, Saturn, from the fall of 2010 to about the summer of 2011, not only is it a time to get serious about where she lives and what supports her, but it's also a time to make adjustments, creative adjustments, to that inner freedom lover inside of her. Okay? And when Jupiter triggers that, that's going to be about early to mid-April. So really the time period from mid-March to mid-April, I really want to highlight as kind of a trigger point, whereas the period from the fall, about November or so, like Halloween, early November, that kind of time frame of 2010 through about mid-August 2011 holds the space. This time period from mid-March to mid-April is kind of the trigger point for this. So it could very well be that a move occurs during that time, and the idea here is, what the message is here, is that things aren't going to really settle out until about mid-August. So I don't know if that means that it's time to take the steps toward moving in mid-March to mid-April, but they don't actually get there until mid-August. That's a possibility, okay? Or it could be just a situation of the move actually does happen in mid-March to mid-April time frame, and there's more of an adjustment internally in her, of that part of herself where she starts to notice herself being almost more allowed to express that part of herself, okay? And that can be a gradual process that started again in the fall of 2010, and she may not complete that process until about the summer of 2011. And it could very well be that a move helps trigger that kind of adjustment in her. So that's all I wanted to talk about with that today. Thank you again for joining me for On the Spot. Again, I'm Christopher Taylor of MyAstroChris. That's myastrochris.com. If you're interested in a full reading like this, a relocation kind of reading, or a natal chart or a relationship, just let me know. Or if you want one of these on the spot readings, you can also let me know about that at my website at myastrochris.com. Thanks again for joining me.